Hello, good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for our strategic discussion and update for Monday, September 26th. And first of all, I'd like to start off by saying to our friends, those who live in Florida, that you're in our thoughts, for you to be safe. And as we're witnessing an impact and getting an understanding of what Hurricane Ian is going to be doing there, then we want to just make sure that people know that. And this gets to the question very much so of some of the science that we're going to be discussing and what's very important in terms of the theme of tonight's discussion, which will be led by Tony Papper. Tony will be joining me tonight and will be our main presenter. So the discussion tonight is going to be the science behind President Trump's leadership. And I think if those of you who had a chance, I know people have been following just the totally ridiculous and the witch hunt that's been ongoing against President Trump, and the fact that, as he rightly named her, you have going on in terms of the ongoing witch hunt and operations for a suit against President Trump that's being led by this woman out of New York, Letitia James, who Trump calls Letitia Peekaboo James in his recent rally. But I have to say, I didn't attend the rally in person. I believe we might have had some people there associated with LaRouche PAC. I know that we did at the last rally, but just to see that he was very strong. I think in the context of what we're going to be discussing tonight, one of the statements he made during that rally, and I want to quote, after he talked about the fact that you have the ongoing attacks not just against him and his family, the witch hunt, the raids at Mar-a-Lago, everything that's been happening. It's not just against him and his family, against the American people. And he said that we are on a mission to restore the republic to greatness, and we're not going to fail. And I think this is very important because as we enter into the period leading into the most decisive election in the 2022 midterm election, that's going to determine the direction for our nation. What will it take to actually truly make America great again, MAGA? And what will it take to truly put America first? And this is where LaRouche PAC and our efforts are very much essential to that direction. It's not just about getting the right candidates into office. It's about understanding the role that we as citizens play in leading the nation out of this crisis and understanding what the positive solutions are. I think that it was extremely important that we brought Bob Ingram. For those who are new on the call, we have a Saturday class discussion. Bob Ingram is one of our historians who actually presented a very important presentation on this past Saturday on George Washington and the statesmanship and leadership role of George Washington. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche, what our movement has always been committed to, is defining statesmen. What is statescraft? And, you think about one of the things that President Trump said in his rally in North Carolina this weekend is he said, I don't call us, speaking of the people at the rally, I don't call us Republicans or conservatives. I consider us to be people with common sense. And for those who have been working with Lyndon LaRouche for a while, they may remember that he wrote a very important work and piece called In Defense of Common Sense. And he talked about the fact that as Trump is talking about the question of this is not just about Republicans versus Democrats, but the reality is the uniparty, the Republicans, the Democrats who are working against the interests of the American people, that system excuse me, that system has to be brought down and a new system has to be put in place, a system which truly reflects our American system of political economy. Now, that system which reflects that is really emboldened and embodied in the ability of the United States in cooperation with other nations to actually meet the common aims of mankind, for us to be able, in the midst of growing tensions, we know what's happening right now with the Biden collective. I will say, I have a statement article coming out on this, probably on the LaRouche PAC website tomorrow, and on the question of, at the height of growing tensions around the Ukraine-Russia conflict, there is still cooperation, and discuss the fact that two things are happening while we're being bombarded with the barrage of media propaganda. One thing that has just taken place is that many of you may not know, but the United States and Russia have signed an agreement about 2 months ago to allow for a astronaut exchange program for US astronauts to fly on the Soyuz Russian missions. We've been doing that, but the exchange is that without exchange of money or funds, we're not paying for seats any longer, but that the Russian astronauts will soon be flying on the SpaceX and US made rockets, and we will fly on, US will fly on the Russian Soyuz rockets. And that first flight of that agreement just happened this past Wednesday on the 21st, this week, where you had the US astronaut, Dr. Frank Rubio, who flew with his Russian cosmonauts and are now on the International Space Station. They'll be there for 6 months. And just before we got on this call, there was a preparedness briefing that was given after 9 hours of readiness preparedness that took place for the upcoming Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station. And that Crew 5 mission is going to be flying on October 3rd, if all goes well, considering what's going on with the hurricane there in Florida. But nonetheless, it will be flying on a US spacecraft with SpaceX, the first American astronaut, the first Russian cosmonaut, Anna Kalinkin, to the International Space Station. So, and it will also have a seat for a Japanese JAXA astronaut as well. But so this is extremely important. Now, as we speak, last thing I want to say on this, because it gets very much to the question of the science behind Trump's leadership, around the question of where we're going as a nation and the optimism in terms of true cooperation and scientific progress. One area of cooperation, which is going to be extremely important, which is being led by NASA's DART program, which is a planetary defense, asteroid redirect program, is happening right now as we speak. And I believe that in about less than 15 minutes now, we will be hearing about the double asteroid redirect test, which is being led by NASA. And this is the first of its kind. It's going to be a first kinetic impactor to push a asteroid off its path and actually change its speed. And so this is extremely important, because we're not just talking about something that's going to impact or affect the United States, but all nations, because in planetary defense, you just can't defend one nation, you have to defend all the nations. And so this is going to be something that has long been in discussion between the US, the Russians called for strategic defense of Earth, and it goes back to the role that Lyndon LaRouche played very importantly in his strategic defense initiative, where he defined cooperation amongst the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, in terms of going to war, the threat of nuclear war. We were talking about technologies and development we can work together on. So that's the direction we're heading. And I think that that's where I'm going to bring Tony in to fill out that picture a bit more, particularly on this question of American statescraft, statesmanship, and the role of Trump's leadership and the role that LaRouche PAC is defining. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Tony.
Great. Thank you, Keisha. So our topic tonight is—
for me, Tony.
Sure.
I want to put you on and it's stuck.
Okay. Sure.
Okay.
Good.
Go ahead.
Great. Our topic tonight is leadership, as Keisha said, and the stakes are very high. I mean, as we sit here, Europe is heading toward a terrible winter without fuel, as some of you know, I think. I hope that recent events in Italy, and perhaps what we do in the United States right now before the midterm, can change that reality in Europe, but we don't know at this point. If it's not changed, then the poor and the elderly may freeze to death in large numbers in Europe this winter. And not only that, which is bad enough, but the same factors which are impacting Europe, and to say it briefly, the insane Ukraine war, the Russia boycotts, the insane green policies, shutting down fossil fuel production, the Federal Reserve and the other central banks' policy of bringing on recession or depression, all of these are hitting Europe, plunging it into disaster. The same things are hitting the United States, even if perhaps slightly more slowly or on a slower schedule. But the same disasters are coming here, which are coming to Europe. And we have to question, looking at that and facing it, we have to ask the question, can our society survive? Can our civilization survive such a disaster? That's not even to mention less developed countries, which are plunged into crisis by numerous factors, including unavailability of fertilizers, the high US dollar, thanks to Federal Reserve interest rates, impossible debt payments. We have a world which is presently in disaster course, not to speak of the possible, very possible escalation and even spread of the Russia-Ukraine war under the crazy tactics which Biden or his controllers have used. So our civilization is imperiled as we speak, and we can only overcome this with the right leadership, the leadership of President Trump. And I intend to not only show you why that's true, but some of the deeper reasons for it, so that you can appreciate it and so that you can strengthen your own role in the situation, wherever you are, into a role of leadership with the knowledge about the question of leadership. And I'm not talking about, TED Talks or salesmanship or anything like that. Knowledge of actual historic leadership, which you can learn in part through President Trump's example. But rather than deal with President Trump as such at the beginning, let me discuss, first of all, Martin Luther King. Like President Trump, who was a great admirer and reader of Martin Luther King, I have long been an admirer of his. I was present at his 1963 March on Washington, which I'll never forget. Let's go back over the King case and leadership in the case of Martin Luther King. It was in 1955, Martin Luther King was a new minister, a Black Baptist minister in Montgomery, Alabama, 26 years of age. And that was when Rosa Parks was arrested for failing to give up her seat on a segregated bus for a white passenger, and actually charged, convicted, and fined. The civil rights leadership, including the Black ministers, or very prominently led by the Black ministers of Montgomery, quickly met and decided on a bus boycott, that the boycott of the Montgomery bus system, given that the Black ridership was very large, would significantly impact the economics of the operation. And with mass support in the community, could probably, they thought, result in concessions toward the dignity of Black people. They actually weren't fighting for total desegregation of the buses, but to end the situation whereby a Black passenger would have to give up their seat simply because they're Black. But the civil rights and ministerial leadership, which was really equally important or more important, they were factionally divided with long-standing factions among the leadership. And although they did agree that there should be a boycott of the buses, they agreed on little else. It was a group of older men who had long factional divisions and rivalries. This is described probably among many other places in the biography of King called Bearing the Cross. So this 26-year-old minister who had just recently moved to Montgomery, people realized that because he had just arrived, he wasn't involved in any of the factions. He could, if he would accept the presidency or the chairmanship or leadership of the movement, it could be done without ruffling feathers, and the whole divided community of both civil rights workers and ministers could unite in a boycott, probably in no other way. Now, Martin Luther King had just come to town. He was straightening out the things in his church. He wasn't seeking really a bunch of outside responsibilities, but and he was very young. I mean, one of the men, actually the man who nominated him to head the movement in Montgomery, said of him, he's 26, but he still looks like a boy. He looks like a boy, not like a man. Nevertheless, he nominated him. And King overcame his reservations due to his schedule, his youth, his inexperience, and answered when his name was put forward. He said in the meeting they had of maybe a few tens of civil rights people and ministers, he responded, "Well, if you think I can render some service, I will." And he took on the task. And this was the pattern throughout the rest of his life, that just that, right? If you think I can render some service, I will. And repeatedly, there was the situation, it's like the old saying, you know, if not me, then who? Nobody else is going to do it. I must do it. So he stepped, for many of you, of course, are going through exactly the same thing right now in your own political lives, as King was in these circumstances. If not me, then who? Somebody has to do it. I guess I must. The day he had to give his first speech to masses of Black boycotters gathered outside a church, or that gathering outside a church, he realized that unlike the sermons he gave in church every Sunday, he had no idea how to prepare this particular talk. And fear of going before the people and speaking, nervousness and fear seized him. He prayed and got some degree of calm and was able to speak. It happened later. I believe this was also in Montgomery when his home was dynamited, and nobody was hurt in the dynamiting, but he ushered his family to safety. Then when he was by himself, he succumbed to panic. All this he told people afterwards. And again, he prayed to God and he was calmed down. So, this was the pattern of Dr. King rising to the leadership of a civil rights movement, which in large part he created. It was a movement like nothing really which existed in the United States before or since, or perhaps in any other country, because it was a social movement led by Christian ministers and governed by Christian ministers. Very unusual sort of movement. There came a time in 1966, as again, many of you know, when the Dr. King thought that in fact, God had told him to raise the issue of the Vietnam War, that the Vietnam War was wrong. The United States should get out of the war in some way. And Black and white civil rights people came to visit King at his home and say, well, of course, I agree with you. I'm against the war, but they'll kill us if you step outside of your lane. This is not our business. You shouldn't be talking about it. It'll do nothing but hurt the movement. And again, King was full of misgivings, but what he said was, according to witnesses, he said, well, God told me this. This happens from time to time. I have no choice. I must do it. He began also taking up in that same period, beginning 66, the economic struggle and what he called a poor people's movement, the betterment of the economic condition of the lower end of American society, regardless of race. And in the same way, he was warned to steer clear, but he felt he could not. It wasn't so much that he wanted to do it, but as in all these other cases, he felt he could not. He had no choice. And as you know, this led to Memphis, Tennessee, the sanitation workers' strike there in 1968, and to Dr. King's speech, which you certainly should hear it. There's no video of it, but you can hear his original talk. I think it was maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, I'm not sure, in 1968 in Memphis, the night before he was killed, which people, call the mountaintop speech, because he said, I've been to the mountaintop. He ended it by saying, I'm not afraid of any man. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. Now, I might not make it to the promised land, but I can assure you that we will make it to the promised land. So, that will mean more to some of you than others, but to me, and I think similarly to Lyndon LaRouche, it's some kind of thumbnail of the Martin Luther King, who was a leader without whom this country would not be what it is, or what it will become in the future. Now, going back 500 years, I want to briefly discuss Joan of Arc, and maybe Keisha can put up one of the statues, a picture of one of the statues of Joan of Arc, which are found all over France, although they're found in many locations in the United States too. This is a view of the statue of Joan of Arc at the Place des Pyramides. So, I mean, there are, I mean, the life, no, not that one. The life of Joan of Arc is as miraculous as it seems. And even in the short account I'm going to give in just a few minutes, it seems totally miraculous and unbelievable. But the life of Joan of Arc is the most fully documented life of any person, probably in history. Because she was subjected to a trial for heresy in 1431 with extensive sworn testimony. And thereafter, the trial and conviction was such a fraud, such a miscarriage of justice, that there were two procedures subsequently to reach a true verdict on Joan of Arc. And the most elaborate was a rehabilitation proceeding undertaken in France over the years 1455, 1456, 25 years or so after she had been condemned and executed, which involved masses of sworn testimony by everyone who knew her, who still lived 25 years later, and witnessed anything significant in her life. So while the account, perhaps the one I'm going to give or any of the fuller accounts, may seem unbelievable and miraculous, the fact is that everything has been documented and sworn to in court, in effect. So in France in the 1400s was dying under the Venetian Norman slavery. France was in what is called the 100 Years' War of occupation by the English under the Normans, allied with the Venetians, in a blood-sucking tyranny over France, which was grinding the nation down to nothing. And the French institutions had just about been extinguished. And the French were everywhere defeated in the field of battle, as you can find in the Shakespeare historical plays from this period as well. Joan of Arc was born somewhere around 1412. An illiterate peasant girl, one of 5 children. By the time she was 17 years of age, she had convinced the court of the French king, who, thanks to the British, had never been crowned. So people called him king, but Joan of Arc called him Prince, Dauphin, because he hadn't yet been crowned. He wasn't yet the king. She was able to convince him to lead French military forces and relieve the siege of Orleans, a huge French city. And the siege was thought to be impenetrable, that there was no hope of breaking the siege. Joan led the French forces, broke the siege, routed the British. She continued at the age of 17, and as the Hungarian 19th century leader Kossuth pointed out, never before has all the armies of a nation been given to the command of a 17-year-old. Never mind the fact that this was a woman, or a girl, if you like, rather than a man. But she led the French forces to victory after unbelievable victory over the British. She did it in the name of France and Christianity, and introduced breakthrough departures in warfare. Especially, really, she introduced the beginnings of modern warfare as a general, although more than a general. She introduced the beginnings of modern warfare into the form of medieval conflict, which was going on in France. Really, individual units going their own way. They had artillery, but no notion of how to use it. It was really a development from single combat. Again, as you see also in the Shakespeare plays of the period, actually. Joan introduced into this form of warfare massed attacks, retreats only on order, and most especially the use of the placement and use of artillery. So for the first time, using artillery, which they'd had all along, the French were able to beat back the English attacks of massed Welsh archers, which is the basic weapon the English had for fighting at any distance. So the final, she lived to see, not lived to see, she actually crowned the king who was crowned as Charles VII of France. She herself crowned him. She freed the city of Reims, or Reims in English. She freed the city from where he had to be crowned from English occupation. She herself saw to his crowning there. So she saw to the restoration of the French monarchy, only to be betrayed by the very king she had placed on the throne. And due to his failure to take any move to rescue her, which he easily could have done, she was sold to the British enemy, placed on trial before a corrupt jury of the University of Paris, the clerics, sentenced to death for heresy, and burned alive at the stake in 1431. But as you probably already see, I mean, she won the battle. And thanks to her victory, we are here. Because what happened over the years, as Lynn has written and we've written in many publications, over successive years, France developed into the first nation-state republic. Admittedly, it was not a nation-state republic founded with a constitution like ours. It was a monarchy. But it was a monarchy dedicated by Louis XI, a king who had known Joan when he had been a child. It was a monarchy dedicated by Louis XI to the goals set out substantially in our Constitution. And first and foremost, the general welfare of ourselves and our posterity. So this was a new development in human history. I have to say very briefly, I mean, the nation state has always been implicit in human nature because the sovereignty of the nation state, which we have through our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, is the necessary counterpart of the sovereignty of the human individual and the human soul. Ultimately, the sovereignty of the human individual and the human soul cannot exist without the nation state to foster and protect it. as Louis XI realized. So that was the first modern nation state, succeeded by England of Henry VII, who studied Louis XI in his court before becoming king. And from there came the nation state conceptions, which gave us the grounds on which our founders created the United States, including our concepts of the American system of economy. This existed originally as the French system, which generally is called dirigism. Really, it's a French word. Dirigism, which is the fostering of the general welfare by the state's fostering of economy, enterprise, industry, trade, and scientific development, which was begun as a state project. It was begun by the French state under Louis XI and continued down pretty much to the time of the American Revolution. So Joan of Arc revolutionized European society to bring us to something which had been always conceptualized as our goal by Platonic philosophy, and before it, the Pythagorean philosophy, going back almost to the beginning of recorded history. And she did it, as I probably made clear, I mean, she did it, as she said, because saints had appeared to her and told her to do it. So that's a very brief thumbnail. Hopefully it's useful in this context. I mean, it raises directly certain scientific questions. First of all, the question is, can we change history? Can an individual change history? I mean, in various college courses and other bad courses, you're taught that history unrolls according to the laws of history. Some people even have it going in cycles where it not only unrolls, but rolls back up and then unrolls again in a cycle. History is governed by historic causes. Can history be changed by an individual? Isn't history inevitable? Can history be changed? Well, I mean, I think, frankly, if you look with an unbiased eye, not just at Joan of Arc, which happened half a millennium ago, Martin Luther King, some of us were alive for this. If you look at the story of Donald Trump, his unexpected and seemingly miraculous rise to, unexpected by anyone, rise to the presidency, and what's happened since, the way the character of this country has been changed under Trump and since Trump, and especially since the way a citizens movement has come forth to take responsibility since January of 2021. An individual has indeed changed history. I mean, there's no way to say that these things would have happened were it not for Donald Trump and his role. The same for Martin Luther King. You have to accept that these individuals, in fact, changed history, but you can't, as an individual, change history any way you would like to change it. It can, and each of these cases really demonstrates that, including Donald Trump's whole life history. It can only be done, first of all, on the basis of seeing completely through the fallacies which govern popular opinion in almost any period. And I mean, here we have today, to fallacies which govern popular opinion, what do we see? Global warming. This is now being taught to kindergartens. We see free trade, the independent central bank, the Federal Reserve. What do we see? We see the craziness of the support for Ukraine, the sanctions on Russia, just to name three of them. So these are popular fallacies, superstitions, idolatry, which is destroying our society, which left to themselves will destroy our society. The mark of a leader is that he brushes away these popular stupidities. He pays no attention to them. The kind of leader which we're discussing, in all these people we're discussing, back to childhood, he has had this spirit of rejecting popular fallacies, of developing superior views of his own or wherever he got them, and developing them uninterruptedly, continuously in his own mind, regardless of the stupidity of majorities. So that we see in all these cases. And on that basis, we see people coming forward who can stand as the sorts of leaders we're discussing about, the kind of leader we're just talking about in President Trump. Now, I mean, our objective, as you know, as I said in the email, I mean, my objective here is that that you listen, take it upon yourself to step forward as leaders, taking advantage of, what knowledge I can and others can provide to you, and what knowledge President Trump can provide to you, and a different way of looking at it, perhaps, which I'm giving you now. Because, I mean, personnel is policy. President Trump was crippled during his first term by not having the people he needed where he needed them. And now, going into a second term, which we have to obtain for him, he knows the people in Washington. But the people he needs, in the numbers he needs, with the understanding he needs, they don't exist. They have to come from the population, especially the part of the population which tends toward physical production, blue collar, farmers, scientists, people who are not living in a fantasy world, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Looking broadly at our country from that point of view, we can see a great division, in my view. We see one part of the population ever going to new depths of, frankly, degeneracy, idolatry, political correctness, sexual fetishisms, LGBTQ++, all these kinds of crazy things. The right of children to, this is more than crazy, it's criminal. It's deeply criminal, but the right of children to change their sex before they know what sex is, all these kinds of things. We see an acceleration in this incredible movement of organized degeneracy among one part of the population. They're hastening downward. Among another part of the population, we see, and I went through it a minute ago, we see a tremendous upsurge in morality, because people are saying every day now, I have to, just as Martin Luther King said, I have to vote, not only vote, I have to secure the vote in the election. Not only that, I have to ensure that candidates who represent the right point of view are presented to the people. I have to go door to door. I have to act. I must. I may never have done that before. So one part of the population we see swirling, as it were, down the drain. Another part rising to responsibilities which they've never had before in their life, and which suddenly they realize are their responsibilities. One thing I would add to that picture is the an insight of a kind of historian named Peter Turchin. There's also a writer, Malcolm Keune, who writes for various publications from Sweden, who have discussed in this connection what they call elite overproduction. And what that is that, for instance, every year, American law school, this was every year as of 2016, so it's probably a good many more now. Every year as of 2016, American law schools were graduating 25,000 lawyers who would never be able to get lawyer jobs. They were graduating about twice as many law graduates as could get jobs. And ditto with other fields in college, especially non-scientific, non-technical. They're graduating a great many people who think that they deserve white-collar jobs and appropriate or white-collar managerial jobs, high-class white-collar jobs, and matching salaries, but there's no jobs for them. And there's no such jobs for them. Instead of barristers, they wind up baristas or something. And that's the circumstance in which, where there's a swirl of charges of sexism, racism, lack of respect for LGBTQ, incorrect political speech, so that what's going on all over the place is that some group of these people whom we might call downwardly mobile elites, the elites who think they should be elites, but there's no place for them in the elite, they file charges that some professor has said the wrong thing in a YouTube chat, 5 years ago, and he must be fired. And his firing will make room for another candidate from this part of the elite, which is clamoring to get aboard, so that they can get their piece of the action, shove somebody else into the gutter. Similarly, all these campaigns against incorrect speech and all, they all call for hiring more consultants to provide to universities, businesses, movies, Hollywood companies, the proper racial, sexual training for their people, proper censorship for their movies or their products and so forth. So more from the downwardly mobile, unemployable part of the elite have to be brought on board and hired, even if others who've made a politically incorrect remark are churned out and thrown into unemployment or something like it. So, as I say, Turchin, from his part, was the original guy, and Keune really show, and I think I probably convinced you just hearing it, if you understand me, show that, at the lowest level, the ceaseless churning and dreaming up of new charges of sexism and whatever extreme charges is motivated by this downwardly mobile elite created by elite overproduction, or the overproduction of elites. Now, that's not where it comes from. The whole program comes from the top banker hierarchy, which puts it out through, the World Economic Forum, Davos, Klaus Schwab, and all these other things. The royal family is there at the top, churning this stuff out. It doesn't originate at the bottom levels of downwardly mobile elite, but that's where it's sort of churned out in the way in which I described. And if you think about that, you become aware that this filthy counterculture, which of course spews out of Biden and his administration as well, that it does not have a staying power, that the people who are in this now will not necessarily be in it tomorrow. They're in a position to be given the developments that are going on. And given that most of the people themselves are being increasingly thrown on the junk heap, this thing does not have staying power, and it shows that those Republican candidates who are campaigning, for instance, here in Michigan, and saying, well, don't only talk to Republicans, talk to independents, talk to volatile Democrats, talk to other people. And similarly, our Republican Secretary of State candidate, Christina Karamo, here in Michigan, she says the same thing. It shows that they're right, that the crazy ideas which seem to have some portion of our population in captivity are not necessarily going to keep them in captivity if we can change it. Okay. All right. So that's for so as I say, there's this moral bifurcation. One part of our population is plunging downward. Hopefully, I think a much smaller portion really is plunging downward into newer depths of really ignorance and immorality, when another part is just coming up from the depths and seeing things which they never saw before during their lives, doing things they never knew before. And it's from us that the leadership has got to come. And particularly that means that we have to push up a wave of leaders to lead government from the local, state, and federal level, and lead and revive our institutions. And this is, as I said in that email, this is the deep bench for the next Trump administration and the administration which follows it and the administration which follows it. Because as we've written on the site, this is not going to be a flash in the pan. This is going to be a permanent majority. This is going to be a revival of American greatness. And Europe and the developing sector, but here especially Europe, which suffers from these terrible moral weaknesses, is going to benefit. Yeah, I mean, I intended to, let's put that up. Yeah, what I intended to say is, yeah, we have people saying to us, I didn't say it where I intended to say it, but go ahead, put it up. We have people saying to us, I don't recognize the country I grew up in any longer. That's obviously, it's people are saying it and they don't recognize the country they grew up in any longer. But to say it over this visual is a bit of a joke, obviously. This is Hieronymus Bosch, Garden of Earthly Delights. And of course, this is Bosch's Inferno. And that is what we see, unfortunately, in our country too often, even when we look in elementary schools. So it's the layers of the population which are really less contaminated by the nonsense coming out of our universities, especially in their humanities sections, from which our new leadership is coming. And the basic competence they bring, which is nowhere found in our present elite anyway, is economic competence in real economy, i.e. physical economy. I mean, if you look at what's going on in this country, what's going on? The country that gave us the Wright brothers cannot make an airplane fly on time, leave on time. The country that gave us Thomas Edison cannot keep the lights on in California. It's the competence in physical economy, farming, manufacturing, transportation, other forms of infrastructure, this competence is the basis of all managerial competence, including political competence. But it's something our present elite lacks totally, and which President Trump, as if you follow him, you know this, has studied very closely as a builder who spent his most enjoyable time with construction workers and other sorts of workers in the real economy, rather than with college grads. So that, that covers really what I wanted to lay out. And I'd like to conclude by summing up with a quotation from Lyndon LaRouche from his paper. Yeah, it's one paragraph from a paper of his called The Historical Individual, written in 2002. I think it's the third paragraph. He says, during each tragic moment of great crisis, every nation, every culture is gripped by the need for a sudden and profound change in its quality of leadership. Its survival then depends upon its willingness to choose a new quality of leadership, which is typified by those extraordinarily exceptional individuals who stood in retrospect like immortal souls, apart from and above mere popular taste of their time. Throughout all the future history of mankind, as during the past, this presence or absence of the determining role of the exceptional individual will always be, as it has always been, one of those milestones which mark those pathways of choice toward either serenity or self-destruction. Choices which close in on every culture at its moments of such great self-inflicted peril as we face today.